Euh, ok, merci d'être là. Nous sommes là. Je vais juste introduire un peu plus le projet pour que vous puissiez un peu comprendre qu'est-ce qui se passe là. Euh, on fait partie de l'organisation Platypus. C'est une organisation internationale qui vise à ouvrir un espace de conversation entre la gauche, parmi la gauche, pour la gauche. Euh, on tient on tient que aujourd'hui la gauche est morte, mais qu'il faut avoir cet espace de conversation parmi la gauche pour que on puisse avoir la possibilité d'une politique émancipatrice toujours. À Platypus France, on est à l'ONS et on fait notre pause café tous les mercredis 18h au Petit Pot. Vous êtes les bienvenus. On se passe pour une conversation plus informelle sur la gauche, sur les actus ou quoi que ce soit. Et on va commencer dans 2 semaines ou 3 semaines notre groupe de lecture. Et alors, on va mettre tout sur le WhatsApp, mais vous pouvez écrire votre nom et mail dans la petite feuille que j'ai mis là-bas si vous voudriez recevoir plus d'informations et sur les événements futurs des Platypus. Comme j'ai dit, on fait ce type d'activités, des conversations informelles, des groupes de lecture et des débats, des tables rondes et ce type d'événements-là comme des teachings. Je vais laisser Lara introduire ce qu'on va parler. Et alors, après l'intervention, on aura un moment pour faire des questions, une discussion. Et oui, après, peut-être on peut continuer à parler plus informellement. Ok, merci.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Lara. Je suis de Platypus, Allemagne. Je suis venue de l'Allemagne ici pour faire des études. On verra pour la discussion. Mon français est passable et mes capacités à expliquer les concepts marxistes sont passables, mais je ne sais pas comment ça va arriver de faire les deux choses en même temps. Mais le teaching va être en français et pour la discussion Rosa est là et peut-être on peut faire des choses en anglais aussi. Alors, on commence. Je voudrais commencer par expliquer en tout court ce que c'est un teaching. La nouvelle gauche, plus connue sous le nom des mouvements étudiants des années 60 et 70, c'est quelque peu trompeuse parce que ça a commencé en fait dans les années 50. Alors la nouvelle gauche a introduit des teachings dans le but de faire tomber la barrière entre ceux qui enseignent et ceux qui apprennent. Alors, le but de cet événement, c'est de vous intéresser à la groupe de lecture et des pauses café, et aussi de créer une discussion vivante. Alors, je me réjouis beaucoup de vous parler après du teaching et boire un verre ensemble. Alors, un petit avertissement, je suis allemande et le français n'est pas ma langue maternelle. Excusez-moi si je fais des fautes. Oui. Les questions posées par le texte annonce pour ce teaching ont été: le marxisme est-il encore pertinent? Qu'est-ce que c'est le marxisme? Pourquoi Marx a-t-il décrit son projet comme une critique du capitalisme et en quoi cela diffère-t-il de l'anticapitalisme? Que reste du mouvement socialiste du 19e et 20e siècle? La gauche a-t-elle de nouveau besoin d'une philosophie marxiste de l'histoire? Ce sont en fait des questions assez vastes. Le teaching que je vais faire aujourd'hui ne peut pas y répondre d'une manière satisfaisante, mais peut-être les ouvrir et créer une confusion productive autour. Alors on verra. Les questions concernant le marxisme sont des questions concernant le processus de développement de la civilisation dans sa totalité. Un processus que la gauche historique cherchait à influencer et à guider. Nous, chez Platypus, croyons qu'il y a des possibilités pour une véritable politique émancipatrice de notre siècle n'ont pas encore été trouvées. Afin de construire un nouveau potentiel pour une politique à la fois utopique et réellement possible, il est nécessaire de clarifier des questions fondamentales concernant l'histoire et la mission de la gauche sociale. Nous, à Platypus, nous nous concentrons sur l'histoire de la gauche. Nous pensons que l'histoire que quelqu'un raconte sur la gauche est en fait une théorie du présent. Implicitement ou explicitement, la conception de l'histoire de la gauche contient une explication de la manière dont le présent est advenu. Nous pensons que le présent est le résultat de ce que la gauche a accompli ou n'a pas été capable d'accomplir dans l'histoire. Platypus comme organisation n'a pas une ligne politique. Nous ne prétendons pas de savoir ce qu'est l'étape suivante, mais nous pensons que l'histoire de la gauche soulève des questions qu'il faut se poser si on veut sérieusement changer le monde. Et ce teaching est une très courte présentation de cette ligne sur l'histoire et notre idée de l'histoire de la gauche. Alors, c'est un grand narratif aujourd'hui. On va commencer au néolithique. D'après l'état actuel de la recherche, les créatures humanoïdes existent sur Terre depuis environ 2 105 000 ans. Homo sapiens, notre espèce, est apparue en Afrique il y a environ 300 000 ans. Les humains anatomiquement modernes existent depuis environ 200 000 ans. Alors, il y a cette immense période de temps où notre espèce existait en tant que société de chasseurs-cueilleurs. Il y a environ 10 000 ans commença le néolithique. Les humains commenceront à se sédentariser et à pratiquer l'agriculture. Et il ne faut pas sous-estimer à quel point ça a nécessité de l'intelligence, de la patience, de la créativité pour apprendre à cultiver les plantes. C'est vraiment un truc génial que l'humanité a fait là. Il faut aussi non plus sous-estimer quel immense changement ça a représenté. Les sociétés agricoles permettaient aux hommes d'avoir des autres fonctions que la reproduction immédiate. À l'autre côté, toutes les grandes civilisations qui ont fleuri grâce à ces possibilités, comme l'ancienne Égypte, la Grèce antique, Rome, l'Empire aztèque, l'Empire inca, étaient des sociétés esclavagistes. Les sociétés féodales avaient une structure un peu plus complexe. Il y avait maintenant les clercs, ceux qui prient, les nobles, ceux qui se battent, et ceux qui travaillent, les tiers-états. C'est-à-dire les serfs, les paysans soumis à la terre, et les artisans organisés en guildes. Alors, c'est une société d'ordre. Ça peut être faux, mais c'est un point intéressant. La vie humaine était peut-être tellement différente dans le passé par rapport à aujourd'hui qu'on pourrait dire que nous avons déjà été plusieurs fois une autre espèce. Ça peut être faux, mais c'est intéressant. Le Moyen-Âge se préoccupait très peu de l'individu. Tu étais né dans ta position sociale et tu y restais. Si ton père était né forgeron, tu devenais aussi forgeron et ton fils le serait également. Cette société d'ordre était justifiée par une cosmologie religieuse et maintenue sous une forte surveillance par l'Église. Il y avait très peu de raisons pour un paysan médiéval, les hommes et les femmes, de se considérer comme un sujet créatif ou libre. Il faut imaginer un paysan médiéval, il n'avait jamais appris une autre langue, ne faisait pas de voyage, ne rencontrait pas de nouvelles personnes. Il se réveillait, buvait un peu de bière et allait travailler. Et il allait au travail. Ce qu'il faut dire aussi, c'était peut-être très peu libre, mais pas super inconfortable. L'idée du travail comme quelque chose où on s'améliore constamment n'existait pas de la façon qu'il existe aujourd'hui. Un exemple pour illustrer à quel point l'individu n'était pas du tout au centre de la culture médiévale et qu'on donnait de la valeur à une œuvre d'art en y ajoutant des objets précieux comme d'or et des pierres précieuses. toute cette idée que les pièces d'art ont de la valeur parce que c'est fait par un sujet génial et une expression d'individualité n'existait pas. L'artiste était un artisan. La Renaissance, qui commence dans les années 1300, c'est comprise comme un avancement de l'humanité par redécouverte de l'Antiquité. C'est donc une idée assez différente du progrès par rapport à celle que l'on rencontre aujourd'hui, du progrès linéaire, parce que c'est plutôt un avancement par retour. C'est une différente façon d'y penser. Dans les nouveaux centres commerciaux comme Florence, Venise et Gênes, se forme une sphère publique bourgeoise. Il y a maintenant un intérêt à produire et consommer du savoir, des idées et de la culture en dehors des monastères et la propagande religieuse. C'était là clairement qui a vraiment posé la question si Dieu existe, mais il y avait un changement des idées religieuses. L'idée d'une vie vécue uniquement pour servir Dieu et être sauvé dans l'au-delà se transforme en vision du monde comme la plus grande création de Dieu et une vie qui peut être vécue plus joyeusement. C'est aussi la Renaissance qui a produit l'idée de l'artiste scientiste génial, un individu qui crée des découvertes extraordinaires par sa subjectivité. Tout cela est rendu possible par une caste de commerçants vivant dans les villes qui devient plus riche. Alors, le mode de vie, l'art et la philosophie bourgeoise se développent donc dans l'ancienne société féodale. La société mondiale du commerce, avec la marchandise comme élément médiateur de tout, se développe au cours des siècles. L'idée de l'individu bourgeois autotransformant se développe en interdépendance avec ces processus. L'émergence d'une société civile bourgeoise trouve son expression politique dans les révolutions bourgeoises, telles que la Révolution anglaise, la Révolution américaine et la Révolution française. Son expression philosophique était les penseurs des Lumières comme Kant et Rousseau. L'idée que tous les êtres humains sont nés libres et égaux est originée du XVIIIe siècle. C'est des concepts du XVIIIe siècle. À l'Assemblée nationale constituante de 1789, les députés favorables à des réformes profondes et à une limitation du pouvoir royal se sont regroupés à la gauche du président de l'Assemblée. Alors, on est à la Révolution française, pas de la Révolution française. Ceux qui soutenaient la monarchie et souhaitent préserver l'ordre établi se sont installés à la droite. Alors, c'est la naissance de la gauche, cette expression de la gauche. Hegel, philosophe de la fin des Lumières, pensait que l'histoire de l'humanité était un processus progressif où la raison se déployait à travers des contradictions. Pour Hegel, l'histoire est l'histoire de la liberté. Vraiment juste ça, tout le reste compte pas. Il croyait, avec des autres penseurs bourgeois radicaux, d'être au début d'un monde où le commerce mondial, la paix et la prospérité créées par le travail sont capables de créer une planète habitée par des citoyens du monde libres et égaux. Pas immédiatement, mais ils ont pensé, ça ira, on va y arriver. Et maintenant, Marx. Comprendre Marx comme un penseur anti-bourgeois rejette des aspects essentiels de sa pensée. La différence fondamentale entre Marx et Hegel est que Marx est né plus tard. C'est la seule grande différence, je crois. Il essaye de reconstruire le système de Hegel d'une façon adéquate pour son temps. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'il a changé? Le processus de l'industrialisation, que Hegel n'avait perçu que du coin de son œil, est clairement visible pour Marx. Si l'on observe des images de l'époque de l'industrialisation, ces machines-là, ils ont l'air des immenses parties du corps, comme des gigantesques armes qui bougent, des bras qui bougent. Ces nouvelles technologies et la production en fabrique ont cependant rendu les travailleurs superflus et non le travail. Ils forçaient maintenant les travailleurs à rivaliser pour des emplois. Et ce capitalisme victorien a vraiment créé une situation horrible. Le Moyen-Âge n'était certes pas facile, mais il n'y avait pas de personnes vivant sur les décharges toxiques ou des armées, des gens qui ne peuvent pas trouver un travail. Il y avait des plaques et des choses comme ça, mais pas ces conditions. Les révolutions bourgeoises avaient pour objectif de chasser la noblesse et les clercs pour établir une société libre et égalitaire. Les paysans, désormais affranchis de la servitude, furent expulsés de leurs terres, par exemple parce qu'il était plus rentable d'y faire paître des moutons, et contraints de travailler dans les manufactures ou des usines. Cependant, au lieu de la richesse produite dans ces nouvelles usines profite à tous, une grande partie de l'humanité travailla plus que jamais et possédait encore moins. Marx soi-même n'a ni inventé la lutte des classes, ni la gauche, ni le socialisme. Tout ça existait déjà de son temps. Il voyait la gauche sociale, la lutte pour des journées de travail plus courtes, les idées comme le socialisme utopien, les idées anarchistes, tout ça existait déjà à son temps. Mais il voyait ça comme un symptôme de la crise de la société bourgeoise. Il percevait le capitalisme ou la forme de civilisation dominée par le capital comme une crise de la société bourgeoise. L'idée de Marx n'était pas de contenir cette crise ou de revenir en arrière de cette crise, utilisant l'État, la force de l'État, comme le proposaient certaines visions anti-modernes que l'on appelle aujourd'hui la gauche. Contrairement à des conceptions anticapitalistes, il voyait le capitalisme comme un potentiel autodestructeur. La nouvelle production industrielle avait permis, pour la première fois dans l'histoire, de produire des richesses et abondance pour tous les êtres humains. Pour surmonter la crise de la société bourgeoise, c'était maintenant nécessaire que cette industrie était prise dans les mains des prolétariats et soit mise au service de l'humanité. Marx considérait la révolution prolétarienne et la société socialiste créée par la dictature du prolétariat. On peut peut-être plus tard parler de qu'est-ce que c'est. Comme un changement profond. Il croyait à cette transition du capitalisme au socialisme, ça serait un changement énorme, peut-être assez ou peut-être si profond que la transition de la société féodale à la société capitaliste, ou même de la société chasseur-cueilleur ou néolithique, et peut-être même plus grand. Ça serait une transformation immense. L'histoire de la gauche est souvent présentée aujourd'hui comme une lutte éternelle et ahistorique contre l'oppression. Pour Marx, c'était pas le cas. Bien qu'il y a eu de nombreux changements profonds avant la modernité, une force sociale visant à transformer la société au nom de la liberté et du progrès, une gauche, n'avait jamais existé à une telle échelle dans l'histoire de l'humanité avant la moderne. Alors, on visite courtement la deuxième internationale maintenant, les marxistes. L'un des slogans de la deuxième internationale était « démocratie industrielle ». Les partis socialistes de l'époque, qui se considéraient comme marxistes, voyaient leur mission, dans le meilleur moment, comme celle de transmettre aux prolétaires une conscience de leur position dans le processus de production et avec ça leur position dans l'histoire de l'humanité et d'organiser la révolution. Trotsky a une fois parlé du surhomme socialiste. Et ça paraît pour nous aujourd'hui assez fou de croire que c'est possible de créer un surhomme socialiste et même plus fou qu'il y a une personne qui pense que lui, il est en train de créer ça. Mais je pense qu'il faut prendre au sérieux que des gens comme Lénine, Luxembourg ou Engels ont vraiment cru que c'était possible, qu'eux-mêmes sont en train de vraiment créer une nouvelle sorte d'humain et de civilisation. Ils croyaient vraiment que la transformation de culture capitaliste avec son esclavage salarial et des individus brisés qu'elle produisait peut être transformée en véritable haute culture et un humain nouveau. Ils ont échoué. La révolution russe de 1917 est restée isolée. La social-démocratie allemande a capitulé en envoyant des prolétariats qu'elle avait organisés à la Première Guerre mondiale au lieu de faire la révolution. Le trotskisme a échoué de manière si diffuse qu'il est difficile de dire quand exactement. Qui reste? Si l'on regarde le XXe siècle, il est probablement légitime d'affirmer que le marxisme était une erreur. C'était juste une idée très stupide. Ni la social-démocratie européenne, ni l'Union soviétique de Staline et Khrouchtchev, ni le socialisme national, le nazisme, ni la révolution culturelle de Mao, ni Cuba de Fidel Castro n'ont créé des conditions de vie utopiques. Bien au contraire. Les mouvements étudiants des années 60 et 70, la Nouvelle Gauche, il s'appelait la Nouvelle Gauche pour se démarquer de la gauche avant, la vieille gauche, on dit ça. Alors la gauche staliniste, qu'il considérait comme autoritaire. Il déclarait la libération sexuelle comme potentiel révolutionnaire inconnu par la vieille gauche et des personnes noires, les femmes et les enfants placés en institution comme nouveau sujet de la révolution. Le marxisme n'a pas marché du tout, mais ce projet de la nouvelle gauche a échoué d'une manière beaucoup moins spectaculaire que le marxisme. La nouvelle gauche a créé des sectes non pertinents et fait son marche à travers des institutions. Ni la génération millénaire avec des projets comme Occupy, la néo-social-démocratie à la Bernie Sanders ou Black Lives Matter, ni la génération des Zoomers avec ses concerns de climat et la Palestine n'ont eu le même impact sur l'histoire mondiale que le marxisme du 19e et 20e siècle. Ce qui reste des aspirations du marxisme, c'était un rêve, une utopie? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Est-ce qu'il y a peut-être toujours des aperçus perdus à redécouvrir? Fini.
Je peux poser une question. Juste, est-ce que tu peux parler un peu plus tu as dit que Marx, il n'était pas anti-bourgeois. Tu peux juste parler un peu plus de ça? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire?
Oui, je peux le faire en anglais, ça va pour tout le monde? Okay, cool. So, Marx is often perceived as an anti-bourgeois thinker, that he was against the bourgeoisie and that's it. But basically he's picking up on that process of the bourgeois revolution that he thinks needs to be finished in a revolutionary way. So you could describe him as a philosopher of the Second Enlightenment, like after this whole bourgeois project, where they were like, oh, we will create this new world of trade and of world peace and of free individuals creating themselves in the world. After all of this falls into crisis and you have this layer of people that live in complete misery, while at the same time you have like possibilities for production that have never been seen before in the history of humanity. He thinks that this whole project of like a world of citizens of the world, free people, needs to be accomplished by a proletarian revolution. Is this what you wanted to hear, or do you want something more? Any other questions, maybe?
I think, at least in my opinion, towards the end, you made some. First of all, thank you very much for your point. About the story of the building of socialism.
Yes.
During the 20th.
Yes, I hope the discussion would go that way.
So, I of course believe that we should have a positive, critical eye of any sort of building of any society, socialism, as well try to learn from what went right or what went wrong at this time. Don't you think that many of the things that we consider as given today would not have happened because of the political revolution and the workers' state? Of course, without knowing, because there is no blueprint. You don't know how to construct a socialist society. We can observe that at this moment. We can make some abstract. We can understand how it works, but we still don't have the stimulus for socialism. So, don't you think that there are many things that were properly done, many things that were not properly done, and that we should, first of all, what they were, like briefly, I know it's a very good discussion, and where do you think it went wrong?
So, these are ginormous questions. I think Second International Marxism could have been the wrong thing, but it was probably the most insane thing humanity has ever achieved. Like there, when you read texts from that time, and this is really what blew me off when I did the reading book the first time, was reading Lenin, reading Luxemburg, and seeing how far they came in understanding what capitalism is and how you could change it. They were really at a point where there was, like, in all seriousness and with all genius that these people had, thinking about how to make the world revolution. And it's hard to tell what exactly went wrong there. I mean, there is Trotskyists that would say, okay, one problem, I hope this doesn't go away when nobody can follow. If you have any questions about all of this, I don't know which knowledge people have and where we are. It's a big group also. So Second International Marxism, basically what they did was organizing civil society. They had socialist parties, so I will start there so everybody is in the discussion. They had socialist parties who organized civil society, and they were in parliament, but their goal was not to be elected. They did like they organized abortions for people, housing. I don't know, when there was dirty water, they tried to find a way to clean the water and make public that the water is dirty, things like that. It was a very different kind of party than that we wouldn't consider a leftist party today. And there was a worldwide movement for socialism in the 19th and 20th century. I personally am very impressed by Second International Marxism. but also Victorian Marxism is an idea of the 19th century. Like it's a very old idea that happened in a quite different stage of capitalism. And coming back to what the Trotskyists say, so the development was these parties became pretty big and they organized the social democracy. So they tried to fight for reforms, but the idea was not to stay there. And in Germany, the SPD became a sort of state within the state. So it was this very organized parallel society. And Luxemburg and Lenin both believed that the First World War was a revolutionary situation. People came back from the war having weapons. And they thought, okay, this is the moment. The bourgeoisie was in a massive crisis because they were fighting each other. And they were thinking, okay, this is what we have to do now. Lenin split his party very early. This is where this whole idea of the avant-garde party comes from. It doesn't make any sense if you don't have big social democracy before that. It doesn't make sense to found an avant-garde party now. And the whole idea was that of the Leninist party was that the highest consciousness of humanity has to be organized in a socialist party. And Luxemburg did not do it as early as Lenin because she thought the whole thing could be worked through ideologically. She thought she could fight an ideological fight with the reformists in her party. So what happens is reformism, people saying, okay, now we organized all these workers and we're in this whole process. So maybe we don't need to do the revolution. Maybe we can grow over to socialism in an organic way. So she split the party pretty late, and there are some Trotskyists who would say, okay, this is what went wrong. Luxemburg was not able to do the revolution in Germany because she split the party too late, and the KPD was like a construct that was too weak to do the revolution because she was killed, which means you're not very well organized when you get killed. Instead of doing your revolution, something did not work. There is no way to tell where was the point where something needed to happen differently because you can't test it. What can be said is that Trotskyism was probably the most serious project following it, I would say. And Trotsky was not, it just did not work. Trotsky saw that in the 30s, the revolution had to happen in America, and it did just not. It's hard to tell when and how Trotskyism failed. The easy answer is with Trotsky's death. But there were tries afterwards, so it's very hard to say. So I understand your point of, okay, maybe things went right there, because I'm still very impressed by how much they understood and how serious they were in actually changing the world. I think they were in a level of seriousness we can't imagine right now, where the left is just this tiny subculture that feels entirely powerless. I think there's right now more people that seriously listen to heavy metal music than there are people who fucking seriously try to change the world. Do you have follow-up questions?
What? Can I just add something to it? Just because I think what I was picking up from your question was, should we uphold the beginnings of the past?
Specifically of
the October Revolution.
Not only, but particularly that.
So I guess that's
I don't have the study that much. But sorry, I didn't want.
Yeah.
All I just wanted to say was that I think that the point that we're trying to bring up here is precisely, well, doesn't the left do anything? Does the left do anything but try to promote the gains of the 20th century? Maybe that's all it has been doing, and maybe you are. And so, what we're trying to have a critical consciousness of, maybe, is of the failure of the left in the 20th century. And what learning from that failure allow us, give us today, or the possibility of an emancipatory project. So I think, again, I mean, we can uphold the gains of
the socialist revolution in the 20th century? Would that be Marxist? I think that's a question to pose. I mean, do you need to be revolutionary to follow the beginnings of the 20th century? I mean, I don't think so. A lot of people in the 20th century have been just become part of the state apparatus and the institutionalized in Europe. Anyway, the point I think is maybe we need to stop just upholding the gains and think about this like what can we from it? I think that's kind of
Also, the question would be, what would going back to 20th century Marxism even mean? Like, I put on a dress and a hat and I go to university in like on like a horse. So I think one important thing about the new left is that they were right. They were right about the fact that they were not living.
Could you just maybe say a little bit more about what the new left is?
Yes, so the student movements of the 60s and 70s, like 68, I think is how many people call it. So there were young people who were basically having the impression that the world they live in was totally unfree, and they had the impression that this was happening in the Soviet Union, but also in the Western world. They perceived both of it as being equally unfree and hierarchized, and like everything was forbidden and organized by the state. So what they were seeing was that their situation was quite different from 20th century Marxism, because the world had changed. Like, workers were not living in these horrible conditions anymore, where you had to work 16 hours a day and lived in a tiny apartment with your whole family, and you died of diseases all the time and stuff like that. And your body, like Marx in The Capital, he describes it once that the body of the workers becomes a fragment. Like, when you put a hammer down all day for 20 years, your body will adapt to this in a horrible way. So they were seeing that they were not living in that world anymore, that they were living like in a world where seemingly everybody was driving cars and going to the cinema and having a girlfriend and all of these things. So I think it's important to see that they had a valid point in thinking that the world had changed, and that therefore changing the world was maybe a different task. Yeah. So that is another thing that I think is important, thinking about, okay, what can we uphold about the 20th century? And like one point I was trying to make in the teaching, maybe it came across more negative, but maybe it was adequate. Like, it did not work at all. History of Marxism is a massive history of failure. The whole history of the left is a massive history of failure. Like, we are trying to build a utopian world since Rousseau, and since that it's just not working. Which does not mean that I think it cannot, but I think it's part of accepting the seriousness of the task, to see that clearly. Yeah. Any other questions or replies?
Very quickly, I think this may or may not interest people, but I think there's a middle ground between this quite tourist depressing approach things to the left, and also the basic approach of let's maintain the game, which is, you can look at the history of the left in a non-linear grand narrative style, which though is useful, sometimes maybe obscures exactly the, as you say, the grittier reality of party organizing, of the material gains that the presumptuous makes. And I think I'm not sure they're necessarily Marx or radical, but in France, one is Laurent Ranvier, who speaks about a perspective as possible and possible of, which is almost a contradiction, but almost what you bring up, where you can look at events of the past, usually in grassroots radical history, and have them as intimations to the future. That doesn't mean trying to replicate them. It doesn't mean trying to turn them into utopias. But it means we're able to conceive of the past in a constructive way, in a slightly, perhaps more encouraging way, and not, because that sometimes I think it is an error of representation. If we do look at grand narrative linear into principle, but that's in the representation, not in the thinking. And I think as activists, or prison activists, students, whatever it might be, that's just not how we experience.
It's interesting that you bring this up. I don't know this theory, so we'll ask you more questions about it afterwards. But it sounds like it's a postmodernist approach, somewhat. Is that right? Yeah, I think one of the problems we have is not necessarily that not all leftists are Marxists, but that there is this deep confusion about where the ideas people have actually come from. And I think if we would raise what is there to the level of self-consciousness, we would be a massive step ahead. So the postmodernists at that time knew that they were reacting to the failure of Marxism. Like French intellectuals that created these ideas, who were at the forefront of creating these ideas, understood themselves as the non-parliamentarily, like outside parliament opposition to the Communist Party of France. So they were pretty directly reacting to the failure of Marxism, because they were seeing all these grand narratives did not work. They did not get us to a point where we live in a utopian society. And they were like, okay, maybe the grand narratives were the problem, and maybe we need to get rid of this. And maybe we need to look at history, not at this, how Hegel and Marx looked at it, this whole process of civilization developing in the direction of liberty through contradictions. But instead, it's maybe just things happening. And maybe if you get rid of the big narratives, you could have maybe not a movement for a free and utopian world, but maybe something like everybody in their way and groups in their own way and their own language could find ways to maybe not create a free world, but a better world. And I think it's important to take it seriously because Marxism has not worked, but also so did this approach not. At this point, I would say all bets are off. None of it has worked. So that would be one thing I would have to say about it. And then I would want to ask, could you explain to me again how this theory works?
It's very rough.
Yeah.
This guy, is a professor at Harvard.
Yeah.
What I find interesting is the original. And you touched on at the end of your teaching, in terms of the failure of social movements now, either the failure to achieve change or achievement of duration or longevity, what I see is not a lack of an accurate reading society, but a total lack of a reuse. This either tends to be contrasted or for other reasons. But the idea that we need a theory de la société or theory sociale, I think we've kind of lost, which I think going back is a very good idea. But what refreshment was left with Johann Montier, which I know sounds like a French name. The concept he works on is which is at once, I suppose, both idealistic but also incredibly pragmatic. And for me, at least, it created a rather more interesting, maybe hopeful lens for certainly had to read fast, but also had to understand the nature of social movements. as sort of reflection was couples that with this idea of not to repeat you have to
Yeah.
I suppose yeah, maybe it's a bit wet. Maybe it's not really giving much, but yeah.
So it's interesting because also this idea of prefigurative, it's also reacting to the failure of Marxism, because this is an idea that's coming from the new left, where they were like, okay, the old left was on the trip, okay, we need to create new economical conditions for a new kind of subjectivity and a new form of life to rise. So it's not like in the bourgeois revolutions, where the new like bourgeois society developed in the feudal society, but rather with the socialist revolution, it would be necessary to change economical conditions first, because they believed that capitalism was so strong, like such a strong way of dominating society, that you had to transform it before you transform people in a meaningful way. And the new left was reacting to that and being like, okay, maybe one of the mistakes they made, maybe one of the reasons this all ended with Stalinism and gulags and all this horror and authoritarianism was that they didn't try to create a new form of subjectivity before they overthrew capitalism. And what they did was like consciousness groups, which is a concept they took from Maoism, but they softened it, where the idea was, okay, you develop a new consciousness together and you take LSD and you talk about your problems and all these things, and you live in shared apartments with other people and you try this new form of life. Hippie culture, all these things. And what one could say is it basically ended in their march through the institutions. One thing the big organization the New Left created was the Green Parties. In Germany, they're governing right now. They really like war. So, yeah. They're basically like every other capitalist party. And also the millennial left. I don't know if this is a term used here. Not at all. So Platypus was founded in the moment where there was a new generation protesting against the Iraq war, which were massive protests, much bigger than the Palestine protests we see now. And Platypus had Platypus formed itself because there were people asking questions about the left and the history of the left and what it all means. And one of the last contacts the left and Marxists had, last time they met, like leftists were in deep contact with Marxists, was Occupy Wall Street. And they also had this idea of prefigurative politics, that you need to build a new thing before you build a new society, which is, in a sense, the ghost of anarchism, because the anarchists also believe that. And Marxism had a distinct criticism about anarchism, while they shared the same goal. So I'm not trying to sell that everybody has to become a Marxist, but maybe it's interesting to look at how these ideas are interdependent with each other and how the ideas we have now developed on the failure on Marxism.
I don't understand what is.
So how I understood it is you create a utopian situation before you create the whole utopia. Hmm?
Reading events in the sense that utopia doesn't necessarily have to be aware to not just it's quite interesting to politics of not just your everyday life, of the daily. I think one example that they also quite big is ecological movements and resistance to massive like in Milan, outside.
Yeah, so the whole notion of resistance as a mode
for the left to operate in is also a mode of the new left. And one thing one could criticize about this whole concept of resistance is that when you resist something, you basically think the thing you're resisting against is going to stay. While the idea of the Marxists was, and also the bourgeois radicals, was no, there's a potential in the world, in this capitalist world, like for the Marxists, in this capitalist world, that can be unlocked by a revolution, and we can create a free society and actually the fucking socialists over you. That was the horizon they had. And what we can see when we look at the history of the left is that the horizon is getting lower all the time. That there was once this idea of like, okay, we're going to create a new world and it's going to be awesome. And like Marx was criticizing the utopian socialists, people like Fourier, who said, okay, we should turn the sea into lemonade and the wild animals should become the friends of the people and serve them willingly. And Marx is like, yeah, this is actually what we should do. We should turn the sea into lemonade, but we have to be rational about how we get there. And this was the perspective they had, and that with that new world, you could create a new kind of being, a new kind of human. While the framework of resistance basically only allows you to be in this sort of group with others where you're fighting against something eternal. And this sort of broader world historical perspective where we could go towards a utopia is often given up for this perspective, okay, we have to resist in an ahistorical fight against oppression. And this is all we can do and we cannot win. So maybe this whole presentation I gave was really depressing, but trying to hold on to this idea of, okay, maybe it's about creating utopia. Maybe this is what it's about. Yeah.
Can I just add something? Just wanted to add something about history that I was picking up kind of in your question and like interpreting history and thinking about history. And I think that a lot of what we're trying to talk about here, I mean, it's not, if you get the impression to be talking about a linear kind of history, that's not what this history of like the failure and regression of the left really means. So regression is this word that we really use a lot in radicals to kind of understand our history, but it's regression. It's a regression that one is based on this left-centric view of history. So first of all, maybe you don't think that history is made or not by the left, but this is the starting point that we're at. That if things happen, if the world changes, it's like a movement of the left, and if it doesn't, it's a failure of the left. Okay, so, but it's regression within repetition. And this kind of really goes back to like a reading of history that Marx had in 1848, when here, well, you know, the democracy that got Louis Bonaparte elected, and what Marx saw in the election of Louis Bonaparte was that the democracy that was being born was actually illiberal. You know, it was shooting the peasants and shooting the workers for liberty. So, point is, 1848 for Marx kind of expressed this moment in history where this moment of like capitalism and like the problem of capitalism and like the problem of the state being beyond going beyond civil society. So this is where the problem was expressed, and it was after this that Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. We were in 1852. After this, because it was at this moment that we realized the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Why am I saying this? Because the history of regression and repetition from a left-centric view of history that we're trying to bring up is not a linear history where the left fail and we're just going back. I mean, we're not. We're clearly moving forward. It's like is like continuity and discontinuity at the same time. So it's more like this of a history where we keep going to like, we're kind of like going to the same point where we're coming back to the same point while advancing, but the problem of capitalism and of socialism and the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx recognized, it's still here. Like the question of democracy, like we're going back to the same issue. So I just wanted to say that, like, you're not really talking about linear history in talking about the failure, because it's actually like a regression that filled with repetition. So I mean, there's obviously an advance in the regression. I just wanted to like clarify that.
Can you explain the dictatorship of the proletariat?
Yes, we can explain the dictatorship of the proletariat. So Marx once said that it's the only thing he discovered. Like, there's nothing original about what he discovered. He didn't discover the class, or he didn't discover the bourgeois economics, none of this. He said what he figured out was the following thing: that the proletarians, once they did the revolution, cannot just use the bourgeois state in order to reform society, but they would have to profoundly reform the state itself. The idea is usually that it's done by councils in order to create a new society, and that it would be necessary that during the period of the dictatorship of the proletariat, that they hold the bourgeoisie down, that they put them in prison or keep them at home in order for them to not kill the revolution. And that would create the possibility for the state itself to wither away. So this is the idea. Like the anarchists would think, okay, the state and the church, they're just bad. You just need to not work with this. You need to build you need to organize civil society. You need to create a new form of subjectivity, and then the state, you just ignore it. While the reformists would think, okay, you can just use the state in order to change the way capitalism works, and you're gonna arrive at a new society organically. And the Marxist point is, you have to use this authority of the state that is basically intervening in everything in our everyday life. Like, I'm from Germany. Like, the state regulates fucking everything. Elon Musk once said in an interview, man, there is now laws that people can come to your home from the government and they can shoot your pet. And he's like, what the fuck is this? These things are very normal in Germany. They don't shoot the pet, but they can take it away. So the state does everything. And the idea is that people grew up in an authoritarian society, like society is based on authority. And to overcome the authority, it gets a bit twisted. You have to use the authority against itself. So you have to use the state in order to destroy the state. And this is the whole idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's usually the thing that everybody avoids when they talk about Marxism. When they came to be Marxist, there's all sorts of people and groups and theories that say they are successive of Marx. And usually they don't want to have anything to do with it, or they just affirm what happened with Stalinism. So looking at this concept, I think, is something that's really important, because the New Left basically said, okay, we have seen with Stalinism that this whole idea of using authority against itself has brought us an entirely violent and authoritarian thing, like, was not good. So maybe we stay away from it. And since then, this problem of authority, that you live in an authoritarian society that maybe cannot be changed immediately to something else, needs to be addressed somehow. The way the Marxists addressed this was maybe the most complex and interesting one, which does not mean it's right, but it's an interesting concept that they have. They would, like, it's dialectics. I'm a bit skeptical about the keywords because sometimes they just obscure the thing. But the idea of dialectical approach to hierarchy and the state was to use the state against itself, and that's dictatorship of the proletariat.
And what does that, so what does that term mean today? And what does proletariat mean today?
Yes, what does all of it mean? So Adorno says you cannot say revolution the way you could before Stalinism, before Nazism, all these things, because basically all this Marxist terminology and all these words are in crisis, because what's ingrained in them is a history of failure and of horrible things happening, and also of ideological fragmentation. So it's completely unclear what this even means. Adorno himself and the writers of the Frankfurt School, they sort of use very strange terms referring to these concepts. For example, one time Adorno calls the dictatorship of the proletariat the seeing dictatorship, which is really weird, because their problem was, if they were standing there being like, okay, we need the dictatorship of the proletariat and we need to make this happen, people would have thought they're Maoists. It would have been read as something entirely different than what they actually meant. So they were grappling with this problem of that you couldn't use those words anymore, but you still needed them in a sense in order to describe what you thought needs to be done with the world. So I would say it's important to acknowledge that all these terms are in crisis, and in order to work through this crisis and gain some sort of clarity about what things even mean and what they could mean, the left would have to reconsider its own history. And also one problem, I think you brought it up, of like, okay, we have no theory of the present. I think one problem is that it's very difficult to have a theory of capitalism when you're not able to change it. The reason why people like Lenin and Luxemburg were able to understand what capitalism is on such a high level was because they were in a process of changing it. So they saw all the time, how do things react? How do they move? What even is this? While right now it's very hard to tell what's even going on. There's a lot of information we're not given all the time. A lot of things we don't know. For example, have environmental concerns, and one problem is that the way governments give us information is to their favor, and the way they organize things is in their favor. So this whole way of calculating the remaining climate budget is a scam, because the emissions are they're once calculated where they're bought and once where they're sold. So the remaining climate budget for CO2 emissions could be much smaller. And there's, I think, a lot of things that are done this way, which make it really hard to understand how the world even works. Adorno says Marx had the advantage that he could look at the economical theories of the bourgeois thinkers and be like, okay, you guys imagine we go into this world of world trade and citizens of the world and all of this, and look at this man, this did not work. And he had a theory where he could look, okay, is this what actually happened? And he could see how this theory is in crisis. While now the Adorno thinks the kind of capitalism we have now, where the state is intervening into everything all the time, and where things are organized in the weirdest way to get surplus value in strangest forms. They're like, people get bullshit jobs somewhat created by the state, and then all this stuff that he said it's maybe really hard to tell, really hard to develop maybe it's impossible to develop a rational theory of the kind of capitalism we have right now, because what we have is maybe so crazy that you cannot have a rational theory about it. But I think one of the impasses the left is in is that it's not able to change the world, and it's very difficult to have a theory about something you can't change, because the world is not, or capitalism is not this static thing. It's a process. It's the process of the crisis of bourgeois society, and it constantly changes. Yeah?
I mean, I guess correct. If you're said correct, is that so? Yeah, like the question for why isn't like a non-linear look at history, because we kind of
to have like, I guess, the reformists to take these aspects of the movement to the left, but then keep firing back to whatever this issue is that is comes from the same impetus as this perspective here, and is like a symptom of the same underlying like issue that hasn't been spliced out. And yeah, I guess is that a correct assessment of why you think that it's not necessarily a non-linear look?
It's not me that's the door, but yes.
Social Lenin.
Yeah. So yeah, so I guess in this framework, then like fact that you cannot diagnose exactly what capitalism is because you have like this entity or whatever that needs to be sliced out that without which you keep with like you might have increasing amounts of appropriation of what the left achieves at some point when you come back to like the same point where there is some structural issue due to which there is like some the state has like some yeah some non-utopian authoritarian control. And then if you continuously have this appropriation, I guess it leads to this confuddlement of how can we characterize what exactly it is that this system is ideologically or working towards when it keeps taking back from what the left does, but returns to somehow this like central. There's still this lingering central issue, but it's kind of hard to diagnose it. And then yeah, so I guess Marx would say take would be that okay, like the thing that needs to be spliced out is like this fundamental restructuring of the economic order, and the economic order is restructured, and this is the thing that is excised out of that, like this yeah approach to utopia.
So one of the points the teaching was trying to make is that the left suffers from an absence of knowledge about its own history, of consciousness of its own history, that we keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Then the idea that Platypus has is that there were like sort of programs installed on the way the left operates in reaction to failures that we did not recognize as such, and that we did not overcome yet. And they would be anti-fascism in the 30s, which would mean giving up your original goal of achieving socialism and collapsing into capitalist politics because you think there's this ginormous threat that has to be fought, the threat of fascism. So you give up the goal of socialism. It's something that happens all the time on the left. And then things that were installed by the new left in the 60s, like Euro-communism, like reform communism, and also Stalinism. At a point, Stalinism just became the way the left operates, like socialism in one country and all these things that the left basically makes itself impotent by not recognizing maybe these default modes that were installed in reaction to failure need to be overcome. It could be wrong, but it's a interesting pitch that maybe gets you a bit further than just feeling hopeless, which most leftists do, if we're honest. Yeah. So this is one thing I could say about it. Is there other questions?
But don't you think that because of that failure of all those historical mistakes,
yeah,
of Marxism or communism, we've lost so many concepts because we were just afraid of words?
Yes. But actually the words are in crisis and people have a reason to be afraid of these words. And I think, do you say it's a problem that people don't want to...
For example, I have doubts about being afraid of talking about classes. You know,
Classes?
yeah, it's just concept of classes. It's not something that you hear every day, like in a newspaper or about any left political parties.
Yes, that's true.
And I think one of the reasons that the proletariat currently does not exist. There is people who go to work and who work to create richness for other people, and that are in like slave-like conditions because they have to work for their boss all the time. But there is no force that is organizing these people and giving them a consciousness of their fight. And in absence of that, it's very hard to talk about the working class. It's also very hard to know who the working class is, because in order to see like who considers themselves the proletarians, you would have them to be organized in a way that they're demanding to change the world. So I think, yes, it is definitely the case that class is one of these minor issues people say with other things, or they're not mentioned at all. But also there is no organized working class right now.
Yeah, and I guess to add to that, like this is an example from Phil Jones's work Without the Worker, where he talks about micro work, which is like this huge industry where people, individuals and impoverished countries are like basically do like data identification or some random tagging, and then this allows the government to like write them off as employed, but they get paid worse than if they were unemployed, and also they don't have the privilege of having their search for a job. And in those situations where you have like these individuals who are just working in some room or to like tag data or whatever for like some corporation that is somewhere else, and these individuals outside of like in many cases are working like in camps where they're displaced, and these work centers have just been set up. They're completely unaware of all the individuals across other countries and other like displaced and marginalized individuals. So even if we can't, there's also this sense in which we can't expect these terms like class and our expectations for a class to be able to organize in the same way we might have one could have expected this in the past, because these individuals are fundamentally in a situation where kind of this class consciousness for like that particular job or like the situation they're in is impeded by their like geographical situation, but also their like social economic situation to be able to like have the time to then talk to other individuals and then realize that they're stuck in these situations where the oppressor might not even be a tangible entity to them. So I guess, yeah, like there is also this need for either an evolution of how we expect these terms such as class and the working class to behave, and also maybe like, yeah, like an active attempt to like come up with new conceptions that describe how this like new structuralized and invisibilized capitalist machinery works in these modern.
I think you're right. I think it's a massive problem that work right now is sort of disorganized. People are not in big factories together. There's sort of these separated people. But I think, Lenin was able to do a revolution in Tsarist Russia, which was a very unchill place to do a revolution. So I think these questions would maybe be questions of the degree of organization. Also, maybe it's not really possible to organize people who do home office all the time. But the other problem I see is if you have no left organizing these people, it's very hard to think about how they would organize them. It's also an absence. It's not only an absence of thought. Like there is leftist theories produced all the time, but they seem to not bear fruit. And there is leftist practice all the time, but it doesn't seem to get us anywhere. And these things appear sort of separate from each other. And as long as this is the case, it's very difficult to tell how things should be done. But I also think it would be an insanely difficult task to find a way to organize people now. And maybe this whole Marxism thing didn't work or will not work. The difference between the the postmodernist thinkers and the Marxist thinkers regarding the revolutionary subject is the Marxist thought you need this big ass subject. You need the working class, ginormous subject, like most people. While the postmodernists were like, okay, maybe it can be smaller subjects. Both didn't work. Yeah.
The question
Mm-hmm.
Jack says, perhaps this model of historical repetition of the tasks and failures of 1848 is even too optimistic today. If the post-left present doesn't raise these problems anymore, what can Marxism teach us?
And that's a big question. We may be in a world that can't be transformed fundamentally right now. Could be the case. But it's true that right now on the left, Marxism is not really something that anyone considers. And basically all the world is anti-Marxist. It seems to be like just this forgotten ideology that was disorganized and disorganized itself in a way that it may not be able to recover. Could be the case.
A marketing thing. I would say for the vast majority of people who say don't necessarily have like especially young people growing up today who don't necessarily have a history or any kind of big communist parties today. The word communism equates style as Russia. So let's say if you see a leaflet of communism or Marxism, you're just automatically, oh, what is this thing? Like I feel like it takes a degree of open-mindedness that they even attempt to kind of go and interact with these questions.
Yes, definitely. I think one thought that I have sometimes is what the 20th century Marxists did was like an insane thing. Like, was one of the sickest projects of humanity, if not the sickest project. And maybe the task of recovering from that failure requires even more genius than what they needed to do. And maybe it's not possible. That could also be. Yeah, that's really hard to tell. You would have to try. And many people tried before. It's not like people did not try to refound communist parties. They did, and very smart people, not stupid people. It's really not about people not wanting this enough or people being too stupid to do it or anything like that. It's really smart people tried and it did not work. And I think one thing that's in the way is unconsciousness about the history of the left and repeating, therefore, its failures all the time. And this is basically what Platypus can offer, is working through those failures and facing them, and also learning a lot of stuff in the process. Yeah.
So, okay, we've talked a lot about. I would like to return a little bit on the last question. Was I did not mean that we should just praise it or maybe. What I'm saying is that there is important inheritance, historical inheritance. There's a lot of material to study. But if we, for instance, let me frame it in a question. Did the French Revolution fail?
It's ongoing.
It's ongoing, right? Did Robespierre bring it? I don't think he did.
No.
Was he? Would you call it Robespierreanism? I mean, 1793. I think that there are some mechanisms in the way that society works. Of course, humans have agency in transforming society, but there are some mechanisms that we cannot neglect. And the question of whether this is Marxist, I think there's a lot of things to be learned from the Paris Commune, from the French Revolution, from the Russian Revolution. Not in the sense that we should walk around and say Robespierre was a great person. Of course, I don't mean that. What I want to say is that we should, it seems to me, I might be wrong, so this is where the question comes in, that the proper thing to do in a Marxist sense would be to look at history sort of like in a scientific way and try to extract every information we can about the mechanisms or its internal mechanisms that are independent of our own subjectivity. In the sense that, okay, first of all, in order to discuss about revolution, we need to talk about praxis, as we said. We need to talk about what comes after. Like, do we keep a market or do we not? Like, these were questions that people fought over a lot during the 20s, and they are very interesting questions. Like, do we have centrally organized economy? Yes. Why? Why not? Of course, we're not there yet. We need to answer more pressing questions that were actually answered in the 20s. So the question is, I agree very much with the scheme of the spiral. Every time there's a failure, I would say something's going. Like, you might not have had the first French Republic, but the world was not the same after the French Revolution.
Yes.
And I don't think it was because of Robespierre. I don't think the English Revolution was because of Cromwell. It was because actually of class struggle. And in whatever failure there was a lot of it. There is a lot to be learned. Yes. So the question is, if we say it's Robespierreanism, or it's Cromwellism, or it's Stalinism, or Maoism, don't we put too much emphasis on the people and neglect the mechanisms of social society? Because these problems will come up again, and we will need to face them once more.
Okay, multiple things about it. I think it's so when we in Platypus use the word Stalinism, we don't think what happened there was because of Stalin's surely many personal failures. It was not that was the problem. He was sort of the manager of the failure. So the question is interesting what one thinks Stalinism actually was. And I think it was the erasement of the memory of the Marxist movement. And it was the management of the failure. And that Stalin and this conservative line that the Soviet Union, that he guided the Soviet Union into, sort of forced him to erase the memory of Marxism. And that Stalinism itself is not really anything but Marxism switching to opportunism. So it's the liquidation of that. And Trotsky wrote an interesting text about the revolution if America would become communist, where he basically said, okay, none of the things that terrify the American population about the Russian Revolution would happen in America because nobody would attack America. You basically have everything ready for communism. Maybe the only thing the dictatorship of the proletariat needs to get rid of is these awful chewing gums. Like, that needs to be forbidden. And his idea was that in an industrialized country, things would not happen like that. And also one thought game one could make is, I mean, the Russian Revolution stayed isolated, while the idea of the early Third International was that the center of the revolution should not be Moscow, but should be Berlin. They were expecting a revolution in Germany to happen soon. Germany was a highly industrialized country. They could have sent weapons, engineers, help, and probably this horrible civil war wouldn't have broken out in Russia. So coming back to your thing of like, okay, isn't there something in the past that was utopian? I mean, it's a very different notion, but Benjamin talks about reading history against the grain, saying that there was maybe potential missed. And I think the Russian Revolution wasn't doomed to fail, but I don't think what happened with Stalinism or Maoism was something that was necessary to bring us to socialism, but rather a reaction to failure already. So it's maybe good to
intensely look at what one means when they say Stalinism. And I think I don't think the Stalinist terror nor the Cultural Revolution by Mao were things that were necessary to achieve socialism, and they did not achieve socialism. Yeah.
I agree with a lot. On what you said for the last question, especially, for example, for Marxism, the scientific observations of economic history of Marx, and then its political project. Because you can see it there in the political organization of Marxism or communism. For example, the class struggle or all those concepts, just to analyze society. We shouldn't call it a failure, right?
I mean, the idea of, okay, we need to go back to Marx. We need to read Das Kapital and understand the economy, and this is what's going to get us somewhere. Happens the first time in the 30s, when the disappointed Bolsheviks, Bolsheviks disappointed by Stalinism, are like, okay, fuck, this didn't work. We need to read Marx. And then Trotsky is like, yeah, but the Bolsheviks read Marx, like a lot of it. So the question is, what was Marxism? Was this an economical analysis that you can like take from the archive and it teaches you something about the world? People feel this way very often, but I think it does not necessarily teach you what Marxism in its entirety was, because Marx wasn't this dude that set himself apart from the world. I mean, he was in the library a lot. There was once a Prussian spy who had the job to spy on him. And his job was just, he's just writing reports, being like, okay, this dude goes to the library and then he sits in the library and it's really messy in his house and then he falls asleep in the library. He had a really boring job, but Marx said, okay, the library is the place where I'm the most social, because this is where I'm participating in producing, advancing the knowledge of the human race. And Marx definitely saw himself as a political actor. And I think that's important. He was trying to intervene into a socialist movement that already existed by giving it self-consciousness of its own historical mission. And the people that followed him, I think the people that took him most seriously and understood him best, like Lenin, Trotsky, and Luxemburg, I would say, their problem was not that they did not read Marx. It was more that there were tendencies in their own movements that were forgetting about what Marxism was. So the highest moments of Marxism were actually moments where people in the movement were trying to fight for the rediscovery of Marxism, or of Marx's original points, which is very interesting. While I sympathize with what you said, I think it's important to see this Marxism intertwined in a process, and that you can probably not take parts from the process and think this is a sort of guideline, because people are doing that since a very long time, and it did not get them anywhere. In Germany, we have this like Marxist cult called the Gegenstandpunkt, and all they do is capital classes, and they make people like memorize the capital for 5 years. I promise you, this is not this is not the way to socialism, or I don't see evidence right now that this is going to be the way doing that. Also question. Good question. So the idea was that Adorno runs through the texts about it, where he's like, okay, both seem to be absent. Like the intellectuals, they just seem like crazy dreamers that don't understand how the world works, while the proletarians just seem like these fucking people that were willing to follow fascism. Like it seems like the people who could form the revolutionary subject are just not there. But he's like, it's still about the extremes finding each other. It's still about the proletarians and the intellectuals finding a way to work together in the party, and then not in the party create a sort of utopian human, but after the revolution that will happen. But it's one problem that the left has, I think, from what I've observed, is the structures on the left in these leftist groups are very dysfunctional. It's often a lot of personal conflict, a lot of cultish behaviors and structures, very exploitative, like a lot of exploitation of people and their work. And that there is very talented activists and very smart people that just end up in these very dysfunctional structures, and they get burned out there, and they become very disappointed and very cynical or apolitical, or they just keep going while they're extremely burned out, and this creates shitty people. I think it's the bad structures creating bad people that are creating bad structures, that it's a spiral where things are worsening each other. And I think in order to get rid of the spiral, I think you're looking for the next thing to do, right? Is what I think the left has to do is to let go of everything, because everything's already gone. Like all these tiny cultish groups and like parties that do nothing but electoral politics and these theories that didn't get us anywhere, maybe we need to get rid of all of it. That's my pitch. Yeah. Because there would be people that could do it. I think there's many very talented people in the world, and also I've seen it in the past that good structures create really good people, and if people are put in a good work environment, pretty sick things are possible. Anything else? Maybe last question? Or are we done? I think that's it.